Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. Today, I'm speaking with Bryan Ward-Perkins, author of The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization. As supporters of the show will know, I've been making an effort to release more of these conversations with authors through my bonus feed on Patreon, but today I'd like to invite everyone to listen in on this one. You can hear all the rest of these conversations, plus some additional bonus content pulled from my own work, on patreon.com/context. In today's book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, Bryan Ward-Perkins has done a superb job documenting the horrors that accompanied the collapse of Roman commerce, industry, and culture when the empire disintegrated in the 400s AD. Now, most of us probably have a conventional version of this history rolling around in our heads. The Roman Empire was one of antiquity's greatest civilizations, and then barbarian invasions eventually overwhelmed it and triggered the Dark Ages of Europe that lasted for centuries. Not until the Renaissance, 1,000 years later, would Western civilization begin to really regain its footing. Some historians, on the other hand, have tried to cultivate a very different interpretation of what happened. Since the 1970s, a growing number of them have been motivated to rewrite that history, to argue that Roman civilization never really collapsed at all, but was merely transformed over time as Germanic tribes moved into Roman territories and new cultural constructions evolved as a result. The entire language they use to describe these events has been completely changed. Words like decline and crisis have been expunged, and more neutral terms like transition, change, and transformation have been emphasized instead. Although this kind of counter-narrative can stimulate fresh perspectives on the past and can remind us that dark ages don't extinguish all of the lights of human achievement, the acute cultural sensitivity inherent in these counter-narratives verges on a kind of cultural relativism that threatens to obscure real differences in how people flourish or suffer. The fact of the matter, as Ward-Perkins documents so well, is that the fall of Rome led to the death of tens of millions of Westerners and reduced survivors in many regions to near Stone Age levels of subsistence for centuries. A dark age did follow the fall of Rome, and his book is in large part a welcome response to more fashionable scholarship that overlooks that suffering for the sake of highlighting the more spiritual cultural developments of late antiquity. And now for my conversation with Bryan Ward-Perkins about his book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization. Bryan Ward-Perkins, thank you so much for joining me on Context.
That's a pleasure.
I'm a really big fan of your work, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, and perhaps you could just start by first introducing yourself, giving us a little bit of your background, and then letting us know how you came to write this book.
I was born in Rome. My dad was a classical archaeologist and a great expert on Roman architecture, so Rome's very much in my blood. I then studied history in Oxford, and I now teach history at Oxford University. I'm actually coming up for retirement, but I've been teaching history for some 40 years. My background is partly as a historian, therefore working with texts, but also as an archaeologist. I've actually excavated various sites in Italy from the immediately post-Roman period, in particular a site called Luna up in the north of Italy, where I excavated wooden houses built over the forum of the Roman city. I've been interested in this topic always, but increasingly I found myself a little bit frustrated with modern trends which tend to play down the drama of the end of the Roman Empire and the consequences of what happened when Rome disappeared. And I thought I needed to write a book on this subject, which is the book I've written. Originally, I wrote it as a very scholarly book, but an editor rightly pointed out to me that it could be of wider interest. And so, without in any way dumbing down the conclusions or the evidence. I rewrote it in a way that was slightly more accessible, and that's the origins of the book. In a sense, it's deliberately slightly polemical against current trends in how the end of the Roman Empire is viewed.
It's my impression that many people that are not historians, they're not reading very deeply in this subject, persist with the conventional view that, the fall of Rome was cataclysmic. This was a disaster, and it was followed by the Dark Ages of Europe. I think that kind of conventional narrative is still very present in a lot of people's minds. Once you get into the community of scholars, I think that this counter narrative that you're identifying here is more common. So set us up with this historiography. There's this conventional view of the fall of Roman civilization, and that was sort of professionalized, as it were, by some historians in the 1700s. I think you mentioned Edward Gibbon was one. He wrote a masterpiece called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. But then there's been this shift more lately, especially in the 1970s with Peter Brown's work, that challenged this view and reinterpreted the end of the Roman Empire. So where did this counter-narrative come from, and what are some of its main claims?
Yes, that's a very good summary that you've given of it. And it is quite true that actually for most of the world, the view of the end of the Roman Empire hasn't changed. In other words, that it was a cataclysm and a violent disaster. It really is only in the scholarly world that people have been rethinking it. I mean, much of that rethinking I'm entirely behind, particularly a view of the late Roman Empire as a very, very interesting period of cultural change. The most obvious thing that happens in it is the rise of Christianity, which starts in the 4th century with the conversion of Constantine and of the empire to Christianity. And very interesting things do happen through the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. But historians have become, in my view, slightly obsessed with the positive, interesting, intellectual and spiritual changes that happened. You mentioned Peter Brown, who is a fantastic historian, writes beautifully, lectures superbly, and has been enormously influential. So I'm not actually against many of these things, but I think what has happened is that people have got swept away a little bit too far with this, and they've forgotten that as well as all these interesting intellectual and religious and spiritual changes, there were dramatic political and military changes, and also a very substantial change in the actual style of life as demonstrated by archaeology. And my book seeks to slightly push the pendulum back somewhat from a rather rosy picture of the end of the empire.
So Peter Brown from the 1970s, along with many other historians in the 1970s, 80s, and persisting through this day, as you say, they've reinterpreted the fall of Rome more as a transformation of the culture of the Western Empire. And I mean, it goes so far. You pointed out one historian by the name of Walter Goffart, who in the 1980s actually went so far as to say that, Germanic peoples that were moving into Rome, this was more of a result of Roman military policy changing to be a more accommodating policy. And you kind of pointed out, he wrote something like, what we call the fall of the Western Roman Empire was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand. And I'm sure there are a lot of other sound bites like that. What do you think is driving this reinterpretation besides wanting to shine a light on some aspects that were less well known? For example, the thriving persistence of the eastern part of the empire. That's all fine and good, but what do you think motivated some of this other reinterpretation of the end of the western part of the empire? Interesting
question. Not an easy one to answer. It's partly scholarly fashion. Scholars rethink the attitudes of the previous generation, so they move sort of firmly in one direction. There really are two slightly separate strands in what's happened in recent historical writing. I mean, one is to play down the military disaster that was the end of the Roman Empire, and that's where Walter Goffart comes in. I mean, he argues that really what happened is the Romans invited in the Germanic people, and the Germanic people, in a partly peaceful process, sort of gradually took over power, so that it was a slow slide which didn't involve much military activity from Roman power to Germanic power. And then the other strand is this cultural strand, which stresses particularly the work of churchmen, writing cultural history and inventing, a new way of looking at the human condition, which definitely was based on the classical past, but arguably is also quite different. And what both of these strands totally ignore is the archaeological picture of what happened to economic life and to standards of living at the end of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, you've got a foot in both camps, I think. You're an archaeologist as well as a historian, and it seems to me that really does give you an advantage here, because so much of the evidence from this far back has to be physical. It cannot be textual. And the textual evidence, as you point out, is to some degree, it can be misleading. For example, Christian writers might have been motivated to play down the pre-Christian success of Roman civilization. And it could also go the other way. Certain writers, as some of these later historians have pointed out, maybe exaggerated the disaster of the fall of Rome just because it made for good reading, good drama. So the archaeological evidence here is so important, and I think really does help us understand the material culture in a way that we wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Oh, yes, no, absolutely. If you want to understand the material circumstances, there is no substitute for archaeology. The texts are superb on religious attitudes or attitudes to saints and things of the kind. They're indispensable for that. But if you actually want to understand how life changed in terms of nature of buildings, the nature of material objects that people had, there is no substitute. We do not have textual evidence that deals with things of the kind. It's only the archaeology that can tell you about that.
There's a lot of artifacts that you dwell on in this book that I think are symbolic of the larger material culture of the empire at its height. For example, pottery, and these olive oil jars, and there are literally mountains of discarded jars that you've dug through. Monte Testaccio apparently is one of the most famous. Perhaps you could say a little about that.
Yes, I haven't personally dug through Monte Testaccio. Monte Testaccio is an amazing monument. It's right by the Tiber in Rome. And it's where the oil amphorae from the south of Spain, amphorae were these pottery containers in which the oil was transported in Roman times. They transported their oil and their wine in these big pottery containers called amphorae. And they were arrived in Rome at the banks of the Tiber. And then bizarrely, rather than actually send back the empty pottery containers, the empty amphorae to Spain, they actually broke them on site, putting the oil into big containers, which was then transported through the city. And there are literally millions of amphorae broken up, constituting a sizable hill by the Tiber. If one goes to Rome, it's not a place that many people visit, but it is a very, very striking monument just to the scale of the transport of goods in Roman times. I find pottery fascinating. Some reviewers have said I was a bit obsessed with pottery, but I think absolutely rightly. It's a wonderful indicator of the nature of an economy, because pots are never valuable. You have to make a lot of pots to make a living. And in the Roman period, pots were wheel made. The clay was very carefully selected. They're fired in industrial kilns. They're then decorated. They're very, very standardized. They're extremely good on the touch. They're light, they're smooth, easy to wash, easy to clean, and very, very functional items. And the Romans, made pottery in vast quantities and distributed it very widely. And I would argue, and I think I'm absolutely correct, that if you have a pottery industry and pottery happens to survive remarkably well in the soil, so that we know an awful lot about it, you almost certainly have many, many other industries producing things like clothes, footwear, furniture, tools, which don't survive so well in the soil, but they must also have existed to the same very, very high levels. And I think the most interesting thing about things like pots is that they're accessible right the way down the social scale. You find them in peasant households as well as in aristocratic households. They're a very good index of the broad specialization of an economy.
There's so much interesting there with pottery. First of all, the criticism that you've received to me is a little too convenient, because it's important to remember, as you say, pottery persists. These artifacts endure the 2,000 years or the 1,500 years that has elapsed, whereas leather, wood, other kinds of material artifacts usually do not. I mean, even metals can rust beyond recognition in the ground. Certainly iron artifacts do. Some bronze will persist, but pottery is so convenient. So methodologically, it makes sense for you to focus on pottery. But pottery itself, just there's so many layers here that you go into. I mean, these pots were not just perfect. And I would imagine if a person, from today beheld a Roman pot, they wouldn't really be able to tell that it was 2,000 years old because of how sophisticated its manufacturing, really was. These pots were branded. There was quality control. And there's another pit I think you identified containing countless discarded pots that just didn't match the quality control.
Yes, that's from a wonderful site in the south of France. It's a site that was making very high quality Roman pots, and they discovered this pit full of intact Roman pots, just slightly defective. In other words, they're seconds. The ones that didn't quite make it up to the quality which they were throwing into this pit. And in some cases, they've actually with a pick, they've made a little hole in the base of the pot to make absolutely certain that it isn't going to enter circulation. I mean, this is an industry with very, very careful quality control. It's also true that many of these Roman manufacturers were stamping their stuff with their names. So it's exactly like, picking up a modern pot, looking at the base of it and see who's made it. I mean, these people are identifying themselves as the people who made this, and in a sense saying, this is a Worcester pot, a very high quality piece of ceramics.
There are other artifacts like this too that do persist. Coins are another one. And coinage is interesting because that's obviously an indicator of a more complicated economy. And the sort of trade networks and market ability that you unleash with some kind of money system, that's similar as well. Coins fall away, and there's really very little, if any, new coin minting going on for centuries. What does that do to constrict economies?
Yes, coinage is fascinating, and we now know an enormous amount about coinage, particularly actually from Britain, because in Britain there's a scheme called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Because metal detecting is actually legal in Britain, except on protected sites. But people are encouraged to report their finds to antiquities officers who are based in museums. So if you find a coin with a metal detector, you go along, you report it. The officer will record the coin, photograph it, weigh it, and probably give it back to you, actually. It's yours. If it's a very special object, they will seek to buy it for a public collection. So we know an enormous amount about the distribution of coins, and copper coins in the Roman period are phenomenally common. In Europe, you can buy a very beautiful little 4th century coin for, around $5. They're just so common. They're not special items. And that's an index of an economy where small change was circulating very widely. And again, we actually find it even in sort of peasant contexts as well as in aristocratic contexts. It's an index of an economy where people needed a medium of exchange. As you mentioned, that completely disappears in the immediate post-Roman centuries. Some coins persist in gold, and that's not a great surprise. But copper coinage completely disappears in the West, and people must have reverted to barter. Now, barter can be sophisticated. It's not the case that you have to go along with your object and then immediately exchange it for another object. You could go along with a cow and you could negotiate with somebody that they would then give you 100 chickens over the next 2 years. You don't have to do it absolutely, one object for another at the moment. You can come to some quite complex arrangements, but you do have to know the person and trust the person, or you have to do it absolutely immediately. The advantage of coin is that coin holds value, and you can then spend it when you want. So you can go along with your cow, you get a lot of coins for it, you keep the coins, and then you use them exactly as you like. Barter is a far more restricted form of exchange, and when you've got coin circulating widely, it's definitely facilitating a sophistication of exchange and production.
The liquidity that is enhanced in any economy with some kind of money supply is, I think, something that's also underappreciated when people look at these very humble artifacts, a coin, a piece of pottery. These are some of the first things people just take for granted. They overlook them. So the basics of life, the comforts, the basic material objects that facilitate day-to-day, clothing, roof tiles, pottery, coinage, all of these things, these are just the rudiments of a civilized life that I think a lot of people are willing to overlook for the sake of looking at other higher aspects of culture. And I think that as you've done here, you've really helped excavate the loss of some of those basics that it seems like too many modern scholars today are just either taking for granted or overlooking altogether.
I would agree. I think there is a problem. I mean, historians are sometimes a little bit blind. They're very, very, very good with their texts. But for instance, they're just not used to, going to a museum, looking at a pot and thinking, what does this actually mean in terms of the basics of life? And I do think there is a problem there. And that's one of the things that my book very explicitly seeks to address. Namely that just objects, things that one uses all the time, are fundamental to comfort and civilization writ large. Because civilization is a difficult word because it tends to imply moral superiority as well as greater comfort. And I certainly wouldn't want to attribute moral superiority to people who make good pots. But I would say that making good pots is pretty helpful to facilitating a slightly better lifestyle.
And that's not really, there are instances where you can look at differences in production styles as cultural differences, but there are certain facets of production and technology that are not necessarily cultural. There are ways of making pots, for example, that are better than other ways, or at least more productive or efficient than making pots using other means. So, for example, in Britain, it looks like the art of making pottery on a wheel, as you say, just disappeared in the early 5th century. And it took something like 300 years for the potter's wheel to come back to Britain. And this doesn't seem like a cultural shift. This seems like a loss to the technological capacity of Brits.
Yes, it is very extraordinary. But it is a fact. Nobody would dispute the use of the potter's wheel, which is probably the most basic technology in making pots in terms of speeding up the production and then also in improving the quality of what you make, just disappears in the post-Roman period. In the Roman period, there are a number of industries producing high-quality pots in Britain and distributing them very widely. All of that just goes. And as you say, the potter's wheel disappears. It's very hard to explain, even because it's not an enormously sophisticated technology, and it is so basic to improving production in terms of quality and quantity But it is a fact. It does go. And it does point to an economic regression, which admittedly in Britain is extreme. I mean, the potter's wheel does persist in most parts of the Western Roman Empire, although the quality of pottery does fall off almost everywhere, and certainly the quantities of pottery do fall off everywhere. But yes, it's striking.
It is striking. And I mean, in that case, it, as you say, may not be so much of a technology push as a demand pull function going on there. So the economy of Britain on the fringe of the Roman Empire may have sunk so low that the market for pots may have just collapsed. So people were making these things by themselves and becoming much more self-sufficient. So on both sides of that kind of economic equation, I think you see that kind of disintegration. And the potter's wheel is just another fantastic index to really see how that lived experience manifested.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, there are other things. I mean, for instance, the manufacture of bricks or tiles. I mean, tiles are everywhere in the Roman period, and tiles do make for solid roofs. You can have a good roof in thatch, but it doesn't last as well. In the Roman period, again, even a peasant household might have a tiled roof. The manufacture of tiles pretty much completely disappears. And tiles, again, are quite a good indicator because you don't make a vast amount of money from making an individual tile. It's only if you've got a very good distribution system and you can sell a lot of them that you can, as it were, have a tile making industry. The Romans had that. That all goes in the post-Roman period.
And some of these artifacts as kind of archaeological evidence for declining living standards and the simplification of economies, I mean, these have really serious implications for the health and well-being and population levels of Europe. I mean, I think there's one particular part in your book where you look at population levels in the Levant, for example, and I believe that you track this population as having collapsed in the beginning in the 5th and 6th century, and this population did not get back to what it had been in the late Roman era until something like the 19th century. There was such a dramatic drop in population. And, you know, it seems to me that this was pretty widespread throughout most of, you know, the Western Empire, most of Europe.
Yes, it's very difficult to be absolutely certain because one of the problems is that archaeologists track population by the objects that the population produces. We don't have figures for actual people living on the ground, but we find them through their material remains. And the problem is that in the post-Roman period, they have far fewer material remains. So in a sense, they disappear off the archaeological radar. So it would be possible to argue there are a lot of people, they just haven't got stuff that leaves a trace of them. But most people would agree that there was a very large drop in the population in the immediate post-Roman century. It's very, very difficult to prove, but it is likely.
Yeah, it's a lot of circumstantial evidence, it seems. I remember encountering a lot of literature when I was writing years ago on natural resource consumption from the medieval era through the modern era. There seems to be a complete shift in people's attitudes toward forests. So around the year 1000, a little bit earlier than that in Europe, you have fear of the forest. The forest is a dark, mysterious place. You occasionally come on ruined walls in the middle of forests, but there is this perception among Europeans that the forest is sort of there to swallow you up. But then as we get into the early modern period, people's value of the forest and resources like wood shift. And of course, then they begin to value the forest as something that needs their protection. But a lot of the early medieval scholars, secondary works that I've looked at, talk about this shift. So for whatever evidence there is, textual evidence there seems to be this fear of the forest kind of coming to swallow you up. And that would, to me, indicate a massive decrease in population, a massive decrease in the number of fairly urbanized areas or suburban areas, and just towns generally disappearing. And I think you've tracked not only rural populations going down, but also more town populations are falling as well.
Oh, yes. Well, town population certainly does fall off in the post-Roman period. Nobody's going to dispute that. In some places, I mean, Britain, again, the most extreme case, in Britain, towns disappear. There are no towns by around 500 in Britain. The only place that might have some continuity of life is Canterbury, the only case really where it's been found. But one might dispute whether it was really even a town by 500 AD. And right the way across the West, I mean, towns definitely shrink in size.
And this isn't just restricted to human beings. I mean, there's good evidence to show that livestock animals decreased in population and in size. Apparently, there have been some skeletons of livestock, like European cows, that have been excavated, showing that leading up to the height of Rome through the Iron Age, let's say the average shoulder height of a European cow, I think, has been documented to be in the range of 116 centimeters. During the height of Rome, that looked like these cows had gotten bigger, gotten healthier, and bones were thicker and longer. Average height of a shoulder increased to around 120 centimeters, and then it fell back in the early medieval era to below what it had been in the earlier Iron Age, something like 112 centimeters. So this is a pervasive phenomenon of deprivation that is affecting even the animals that humans are living with.
Yes, I'm not an expert on this, and I'm impressed by your grasp of the figures. But there is evidence to suggest that livestock production became more sophisticated in the Roman period, and that, of course, requires specialization, like, for instance, having pasturage, which you can then cultivate for hay, for overwintering animals. And that sort of sophistication does seem to have developed in the Roman period and to have fallen back, I mean, dramatically in the post-Roman period. It's an area, though, that I think that modern research will reveal more about. I mean, the other thing that it would be very nice to know about is what actually happened to human skeletons. Were Romans larger than post-Roman people? Did they live longer? And possibly in the future, with more work done on human skeletons, we might be able to tell something about that. At the moment, really, the research isn't quite advanced enough.
It's interesting. The amount of different evidence really does come together here. I think one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence I've ever encountered, which you also present here, was pollution levels. So there's this recent research done in ice cores, especially like the ice cap of Greenland, for example, that metalworking, which is tracked according to the levels of pollution given off by smelting in the atmosphere, so lead and copper and so forth, that levels of pollution just plummeted at the end of the Roman Empire and did not reach the same levels again until the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, pollution doesn't sound like a very good thing, but when it tracks with industry and you see it collapse, that's another pretty good piece of evidence that life globally, I mean, the level of industry globally did take a tremendous hit.
Yes, no, I mean, it's quite true. I mean, there is a downside, obviously, to all economic development, namely its impact on the natural environment. And the Romans did have quite a big impact on the natural environment. And certainly the natural environment fights back in the immediately post-Roman period. And obviously, viewed from the 21st century, levels of pollution are worrying. And there is that downside, but it is also an index of sophistication and of productivity. And obviously what we're now seeking to achieve is productivity without pollution. The Romans didn't have to worry about that so much because obviously the scale of what they're doing, it's probably matched by the early modern period, 16th, 17th century. And really, it's only with heavy industrialization in the 19th, sort of 20th century that pollution becomes a global problem rather than just a local one. I mean, in the Roman times, certainly there would have been local pollution of a very unpleasant kind. And certainly Roman towns, for instance, were not, particularly salubrious in terms of smells and in terms of industrial production, like sort of tanning works, very close to domestic houses.
What was going on in the world toward the 5th century that caused all of these Germanic tribes to encroach? I mean, I think I was wondering, was there something outside of the empire's borders that was causing Rome to experience a lot of, unprecedented external pressure? Or was this pressure kind of always there, but Rome's ability to withstand it is what changed?
Well, there was always pressure. And arguably, that's reasonably easy to understand. The Roman Empire was very developed economically. It's got all this coinage, all these fine buildings, all this pottery, a living standard which was considerably higher than that of its immediate neighbours outside the empire, the people who were east of the Rhine and north of the Danube. They don't have that same high level of sophistication in their economy. So there's always going to be a pull factor into the empire of people from outside, and that will include a military pull factor, a desire to enjoy the benefits of Roman life and to take it over. So there was a constant equilibrium between forces outside and the power of Rome. And Rome always had to maintain a large army on the frontiers in order to keep people out. Furthermore, the balance of power was always quite delicate because the Romans, although they're much better organized, and they have, for instance, factories that mass-produced weapons. So they're better equipped, they're better organized. They've got Roman roads which bring, provisions to the frontier when needed. They've got forts, stone-built forts, which again, for instance, don't exist outside the Roman Empire. So they are better equipped and they're better organized. But nonetheless, it's not like the 19th century where Western powers had the Gatling gun and could literally mow down large numbers of people, who didn't have the Gatling gun. The Romans didn't have a vast technological superiority over the people outside. So it's always quite delicately balanced. What happens at the end of the empire is disputed. Possibly Roman power declines, possibly because their economy is already in decline, and that would have an impact on their military might because the Romans, like us, have a professional army, so it depends on money. You need to have the money to pay for the soldiers. Maybe their economy is in slight decline. Nobody would argue in a major way, but possibly slightly. The thing that's most controversial is whether the forces outside the empire, the various Germanic people, are stimulated into becoming more forceful and more united by an external pressure, which is the coming of the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people who originated in East Asia. They're almost certainly the same people who had been attacking the Chinese Empire in roughly the same period. They unquestionably arrive in the West at the end of the 4th century. We know that for certain because they're very well recorded. But then whether it's them that drive the Germanic people into the empire, in other words, giving a new kind of impetus to invasion, is disputed. I think it's quite likely that it was. The trouble is, we'll never know for certain because what's going on outside the empire is not recorded in writing. The people up there are prehistoric. They don't have written texts. So everything that's going on east of the Rhine and north of the Danube is very obscure. I think probably the Huns were important in stimulating Germanic people to a renewed invasion of Rome.
It's interesting to imagine the larger kind of macro historical forces that are taking place on the supercontinent of Eurasia during the 100s and 200s. The Han Dynasty of China was growing in sophistication quite rapidly as well, and it seems to be that this flourishing of the very first kind of pan-Eurasian trade networks during these centuries could have been very disruptive for a lot of people and dislocated a lot of different communities, especially when it comes to disease. William McNeill's Plagues and Peoples was a great book documenting some of these terrible epidemics that swept through the Roman Empire during, the 160s AD, and then another one a century later, killing huge fractions of Roman citizens. Something like 5,000 people died every single day in Rome during the first of these plagues, and then something like, which is hard to believe, 10,000 people every day died in Constantinople during the worst of the plague in the 260s. This has got to be a factor in the collapse of tax revenue, which in turn, as you say, is totally crippling to Rome's military power and ability to withstand incursions.
Yes, that is actually disputable because we know, the 14th century has the Black Death, and we know for certain, because we have reasonably good figures from the 14th century, that between a third and a half of the population die in the course of 2-3 decades. Now, that's a really dramatic fall in population. But oddly enough, it doesn't necessarily have quite the terrible economic impact that one might expect. The reason is that arguably a very large population that is using all the resources available to survive doesn't have the resources to turn production into wealth, whereas a slightly smaller population has more resources per capita and is therefore actually able to generate a slightly more prosperous economy. It's not absolutely straightforward that large numbers of people mean a wealthy economy. It can be the opposite. So I'm not sure. I think it's possible that plague was very, very important, but I'm not absolutely certain.
It's an interesting observation. You're right. A lot of scholarship has made it clear how well certain echelons of laborers, for example, did in the wake of the Black Death. Clearing out a lot of positions of power essentially allowed for a more social mobility in the generations after the Black Death of the 1300s. So there are those indications that there were some benefits, ironically. You're right.
If you look at Western Europe in 1300, and then you look at it in 1400, with the Black Death in between, I don't think you would actually notice, if you just looked at 1300 and 1400, that something cataclysmic had happened in between, which it did in terms of population size. You'd actually think that Europe was on roughly the same trajectory. There is economic disruption as a result of all that death, but it's not as nearly as great as you'd expect, given the cataclysmic nature of the Black Death.
Now, that comparative history is probably more attractive than too attractive for its own good. I would love to compare the resiliency of the Roman Empire to plague, through the 100s and 200s AD versus the, Europe's, resilience to plague in the 1300s, and see just how different their responses are and what the kind of social mobility opportunities are. But I think you're right. It's quite complicated. There's probably some conflicting factors there. One of the questions I think your book brings up, that's a tough question. It's hard to answer and has to some extent become a bit taboo. And I know that we are, very sensitive to this question, but how do we judge civilizations comparatively? The word civilization itself is almost becoming taboo among historians and archaeologists, but, you can use a replacement like culture. When we look at what happened after the fall of Rome, how do we judge what was better or worse there? Can we judge what was better or worse there? I mean, clearly, as we've been discussing, there was a total collapse in the material culture, the material comforts of day-to-day life, from the material you use to roof your house to prevent getting rained on, to the kind of containers you use to transport your foods and beverages, to the techniques you're using to facilitate exchange, to the livestock you have around you to feed you and clothe you. These things absolutely were diminished. But at the same time, life goes on. How are we to judge different kinds of cultural paradigms, and can we ever say one is better than another? How do you think about this question?
Well, you've put it very well, and it is problematic. And there are really kind of two uses of the word civilization. I mean, one, which is the usage that I'm using in my book, is about just levels of complexity, particularly sort of economic complexity. Although with that would also go social complexity, with people having connections across wide regions, which otherwise, wouldn't be happening. And the other use, of course, is to sort of see it as somehow or other a moral good. I would reject the latter definition absolutely, and just concentrate on thinking about civilizations as complex societies. And one could have said, my book could have been called The Fall of Rome and the End of a Complex Economic Society. It just wouldn't sound quite so good. It probably wouldn't sell quite so well. But there is a problem. I mean, there is a problem about whether one sees a civilization as sort of morally better. I think, though, and this is a major argument in my book, that we all rely heavily on the levels of complexity and comfort that complexity gives us. I'm sitting in a very nice, solid room with good heating. I'm talking to you on Skype with a laptop, and all of this is really very basic to my existence and very basic to everything I do. We just take that for granted. And I think it is very interesting to look at the end of the Roman world, when their world was nothing like as complex and sophisticated as ours, but it was complex and sophisticated, and very large parts of that disappear. I mean, in my book, I actually also argue that it is the very complexity that is precarious and dangerous, because Romans came to be used to buying their pots from people who made them maybe even hundreds of kilometers away, possibly even across the sea. And that is precarious. Our world, the complexity is just as precarious, and we shouldn't take it for granted.
I think there was a passage in your book where you write that all of the things you just mentioned, from your nicely heated room to your computer, takes hundreds of thousands, theoretically hundreds of thousands of people are involved in your well-being and in my well-being today, which is just mind-boggling. In Rome, obviously, ancient Rome, it wasn't anywhere near that high, but it was dozens, hundreds. I mean, this kind of network of specialization, of socioeconomic specialization, presents so many strengths in enriching the complexity of society and the capabilities of every individual. Once you have the basic rudimentaries of life, you can learn to read, you can learn to understand other cultures, you can understand the past, but at the same time, you lose so many of the skills necessary for basic survival. So there's strengths and weaknesses built into that specialization. And you're right, that's an irony that I think you document quite well in this book.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I would be completely useless in doing anything. Well, not quite. I could do some practical things, but we depend on these vast, complex arrangements Whereas you say hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, are required just for our ordinary daily life. And in the Roman Empire, it was thousands. It's nothing like the complexity of the modern world, but it's getting there.
We depend on one another so much, and as civilization becomes more complex, we depend on each other more and more. So I guess the question for people when they think about the fall of Rome, when they think about the transformation, if they want to think about it a different way into a sort of a more Germanic tribal culture, is not necessarily what's better or worse, but just what kind of world they would want to live in for themselves, what they would want to enjoy, what kind of access they'd want to have. If they'd rather spend their days building the basics of life or learning about other cultures, reading books, building businesses, and so forth. So as you say, I agree with you totally. It's not so much a moral calculation as it is just the kind of complexity of society and what we're striving for. I think about that a lot. As a historian, is where is this all going? What is the purpose? And it seems to me that complexity is definitely a metric of progress on some level, although it's very complicated and hard to define. And I think, a lot of different people define it in different ways.
Absolutely. And of course, it does have its disadvantages, and particularly in the very modern period, in terms of the impact on the natural environment, which is a major problem.
Big problem. Although it's maybe a little comforting, if we want to finish on a high note, that the more powerful our technology becomes, the more problems it causes, but perhaps the more equipped we become to solve those problems, or at least identify them.
Let's hope that is the case.
Well, Bryan, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, and thank you again for coming on Context. I really encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to read this book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, to dig deep, as you've done, into the material culture and the dramatic changes and disruptions that occurred during the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. So thank you again, Bryan.
Thank you, Brad.